Hello, this is chapter 12. It's called The Geese. Here they are. So I think the picture of chapter 11 must have been geese on the river, not ducks. Anyway, hopefully Mr. Howard has stopped cutting wood, but we'll see. You might be able to hear there's a coal tit in the tree just outside the window, and he's singing and singing. There he is. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's quite loud. Anyway. The geese must have started their procession through the hedge into the garden soon after sun-up one day, for when the dew was still thick on the grass of the lawn, there they were. Tom had stolen down from the flat at about midnight as usual. He had opened the hall door to find early morning outside in the garden. That had not surprised him, but the sight of the geese had. The two geese and the gander raised their necks as usual to stare at him, but the goslings paid no attention. They rambled over the lawn with uncertain interest. They plucked at the grass a little. One lowered his head to sip the dew. Several curved white breast feathers lay on the lawn like little boats, and, far worse, there were one or two dark green goose messes. What will they say, thought Tom, meaning Abel and Hubert and James and Edgar and Susan, the housemaid, and the severe woman whom he guessed to be Hattie's aunt. All the people he knew of. Hattie he did not include among the others, because he knew she must be indirectly responsible for this, she and her secret way through the hedge. Of course Tom was to blame too. He freely admitted that to himself, and would have admitted it as freely to anyone who could have heard his voice. There were soon others to see the geese besides Tom. First of all, Abel came along one of the paths to the lawn. He halted, his blue eyes opened very wide, and his mouth too. But he stood speechless. Then the sash of one of the bedroom windows went up, and Tom heard a commanding voice that he was sure belonged to Hattie's aunt. She called and asked what the geese were doing there, although at that moment it was only too plain to see, and what he was going to do, and how they got there anyway, and especially, Tom's heart sank, who was to blame. Abel began methodically to answer at least the first two questions, but in the middle the window was slammed down. There was a commotion of voices and footsteps upstairs, then coming down the stairs. It sounded like the whole household coming. Tom took cover behind a tree. In this kind of situation, instinct to hide overrode all his uncertainty of being unseen. He even felt uneasy that, in taking up his position, he had had to cross Abel's line of vision for an instant. Soon enough they all came hurrying out of the house onto the doorstep. Hattie was with them, attracted by the excitement, and not realizing its significance for herself. Hubert and James and Edgar hovered in the foreground, ready for action. "Don't hurry them," Abel was calling from the other side of the lawn. "We'll drive 'em out into the orchard where they can't do no harm, and then I'll get 'em round into that old meadow again." Now Pincher, the dog, had arrived, last of all. He pushed his way through the legs of the group on the doorstep and stood before them. "Get the dog away," called Abel. As he spoke he was slowly moving forward among the geese. The three boys began the same movement, herding the geese in the direction of the door from into the orchard. Nobody paid attention to Abel's warning about the dog. After all, he was remaining quietly upon the doorstep. Tom, however, could see that he had begun to shiver with excitement. He would not be able to restrain himself for long. The geese were allowing themselves to be moved along, their heads high and ceaselessly turning, the goslings going ahead. The gaggle was suspicious, nervous, on the brink of panic. A sudden rush and barking of Pincher pushed them over that edge into a kind of goose hell that was thereupon set loose. At once, instead of two geese and a gander, there seemed to be a dozen, making the noise of 100. White and grey wings at the stretch seemed to bar the whole lawn and flailed the air. Geese, gander and goslings ran in the confusion of terror or anger, trampling over flower beds, trampling over their own messes, trampling over each other. Tom saw the gander at one moment making a stand in defence of his young, with his enormous flat foot squarely on the back of one of them. Luckily, a large webbed foot is by no means as dangerous as a boot, and the gosling looked hardly flatter, although more flurried, afterwards. Altogether, the only damage, but it remained considerable, was to the flower beds and the lawn. Even the dog had had the sense to run clean through the storm of snapping beaks and round to the outskirts and into the house again, its tail between its legs. Abel and the boys drew back a little too, a frenziedly angry gander with his wives by his side and his goslings behind him, and even under him, is a daunting sight. So they waited until the gaggle had a little calmed itself. Then, much more cautiously this time, they began to herd again. Hattie ran ahead to open the orchard door. Tom stayed in hiding. There was nothing to be seen now except the devastated lawn, and on the doorstep one person remaining, Hattie's aunt. Tom had thought her stern-looking before. He liked the expression of her face even less now. From their different positions, she and Tom heard what was going on. The goose drivers reached the orchard door, and evidently the geese were safely got through, for there was a cry of triumph from one of the boys, and then the slamming shut of the door. Then Tom expected to see them all coming back to the house, but they did not. He realised in a moment that they were making their way to the meadow side of the garden to find out how the geese had got in at all. As they went, there came occasionally the sound of a lamenting cry from Abel. Then their voices were heard along the meadow hedge. Then at last they reappeared on the lawn. Hattie was not with them. Tom guessed, now that she knew her share of the blame, she had gone into hiding. As the others came across the lawn, Abel raised his voice in the same deep, sad cry. He spoke of lettuces ripped to pieces by the geese, and of other plunderings, of seedlings trampled and broken, of goose messes where they were least desired, and then, in answer to a sharp question from his mistress, he told of the gap and the tunnel in the hedge through which the geese must have come. "How they made that way unbeknownst is more than I know, unless the devil himself taught them," said Abel with a grieving wonder. "They didn't make it," said Edgar suddenly. "Hattie did." It was only a guess, Tom was sure, but everyone saw at once the likelihood of the idea. Abel stopped speaking abruptly, as though his mind had gone into reverse on the subject. The others were quiet too, so quiet that Tom, even from the distance of his tree, could hear the breathing of Hattie's aunt. It had become heavy and rasping. "Harriet!" she called, so loudly and harshly that the sound was not like a woman's voice at all. Hattie came out from hiding and walked across the lawn to her aunt, not quickly, not slowly. Her face was white, so that her eyes and hair appeared blacker than ever. Her face was quite white, Tom realised afterwards, that even her lips had been colourless too. She stopped in front of her aunt. Her aunt did not ask whether she had made the gap in the tunnel and why. She asked none of the questions that Tom had expected. She asked no questions at all. She said, "You are to blame." Hattie did not speak. It seemed to Tom that she could not. All the persons that her fancy had ever brought into this garden, biblical heroes and fairies and the people of legend and hearsay and her own imagination, all her friends fell away from her now. Even Tom could not speak for her or lift a finger to help her. He turned his face away, because he expected Hattie's aunt to strike her, but she did not. She spoke to Hattie instead. She called Hattie a charity child, a thankless pauper that she had received into her home as a duty to her late husband, whose niece Hattie was. She said that only the claims of blood had induced her to take this mistaken pity upon Hattie. She expected Hattie to be grateful and dutiful and obedient, and instead she was none of these things, but an expense and a shame to her aunts and cousins. A liar, a criminal, a monster. Mr. Howard's making funny noises outside again. Just carry on. "Oh," Tom whispered frenziedly to himself, "why don't her mother and father take Hattie away? Away!" He believed no longer, he had not believed for a long time, that Hattie's parents were a king and queen. But surely even the poorest, humblest parents would rescue their child from this. His mother would, his father would, in a great rush and roar of indignation that was made by their love for him. Doesn't Hattie's mother know? Why doesn't Hattie's father come? He crouched and covered his face with his hands, crying out at his own powerlessness. He heard the cruel voice go on, and then at last stop, and then nothing but silence. Unwillingly, after a while, he raised himself and looked towards the house. Whether all of them, including Hattie herself, had gone their way in that silence, or whether they had all literally vanished away, he could not say. He walked away from the place where they had been, down to the bottom of the garden, and climbed the low wall there. He wandered among the trees beyond, and at last sat down on the foot of one of them, and a kind of exhaustion fell asleep. When he woke, he was aware of some difference in his surroundings, a difference in time, he thought to be. Yet the sunshine through the leaves of the trees was still coming from the east. It was still morning. He went back over the wall into the garden and began to look for Hattie or Abel or anybody but the dreadful woman. Turning the corner into the sundial path, he saw at the end of it a tiny little figure, all in black. A little girl, half Hattie's size, in a black dress, black stockings, black shoes. Even her hair was black and had been tied with a black hair ribbon. Now the ribbon had come undone, and her loose hair fell forward over her face, and her hands were up to her face too, hiding it. She was sobbing into her hands. Tom had never seen a grief like this. He was going to tiptoe away, but there was something in the child's loneliness and littleness that made him change his mind. This morning especially, for some reason, he could not say this was none of his business. He came up close to the child, and it seemed silly, for no one but Hattie in all that garden had ever heard his voice. He spoke. "Don't cry," he said. To his surprise, she did hear him. She turned slightly towards him as if for comfort, but she did not cease her weeping, nor take her hands from her face. "What are you crying for?" asked Tom gently. "For home," she wept, "for my mother, for my father." Then Tom understood the meaning of the funeral black she was wearing, and of that desolate, ceaseless crying. There was something else too, something almost unbelievable that he felt he would understand in another instant. Something familiar in her voice and way of speaking, something in the way she was. "In the meantime, don't cry," he said helplessly. "Oh, cousin," she sobbed. Then, with a little shake of the mind, Tom knew. She had mistaken him for a cousin, for Cousin Hubert or Cousin James or Cousin Edgar. This was Hattie, exactly the Hattie he knew already, and yet quite a different Hattie, because she was, yes, that was it, a younger Hattie. A very young, forlorn little Hattie, whose father and mother had only just died, and whose home was therefore gone. A poor, penniless orphan Hattie, who had been taken grudgingly to this house and family by an aunt whose love went no further than her own 3 sons, and whose charity was as cold as her heart. Now was not the time to startle this Hattie by showing her that he was not one of the cousins after all, nor was it possible to comfort her. Tom said no more, but tiptoed away. He never saw the little Hattie again. He saw the older, other Hattie as usual on his next visit to the garden. Neither then nor ever after did he tease her with questions about her parents. When, sometimes, Hattie remembered to stand upon her dignity and act again the old romance of her being a royal exile and prisoner, he did not contradict her. Oh, it was quite a sad chapter. Oh, Mr. Howard again. The next chapter, chapter 13, is called The Late Mr. Bartholomew. So we'll do that next time.